I feel like I haven't been controversial enough. I mean, I've covered things like rape culture, free speech, abortion, non-minority privilege, gun control. Those are some pretty milquetoast topics. Let's spice things up a little and talk about transgender ideology. Let's get a couple of things out of the way right out of the gate. This isn't a video about transgender rights. That is, whether trans people should have rights, qua trans people, and which rights they should have. This also isn't a video about the morality of transitioning from one gender to another. That is, whether it's morally okay to do so, whether socially or through hormonal and surgical intervention. Finally, this isn't a video about how to deal with the very real problem of gender dysphoria. That's way above my pay grade. This is simply a video about the internal consistency, or lack thereof, of transgender ideology. That is, whether all of the claims that gender theorists and transgender activists typically make actually fit together into a coherent package. I'm going to argue that they don't fit together. This might have downstream implications for questions surrounding trans issues, but I won't be pursuing those in this video. Contemporary gender theorists and transgender activists typically make the following 4 claims. First, gender is distinct from sex. Gender is usually defined in terms of social roles and personality, and sex is usually defined biologically in terms of genotypes and phenotypes. 2. Particular genders and particular sexes are separable. They can and do come apart. 3. There is no way your gender is supposed to be given your sex, or vice versa. That is, there's no normative connection between a particular gender and a particular sex. But 4. There can be a mismatch between your gender and your sex. You can be a man trapped in a woman's body, and vice versa. There are pairings of genders and sexes that are actually wrong and require correction. It seems to me that these 4 claims just don't fit together. Something's got to give. Let me explain. Claims 1, 2, and 3 are typically held by modern feminists. They more or less amount to a rejection of gender essentialism. That is, the claim that a particular gender both must and should line up with a particular sex. The basic idea behind the rejection of gender essentialism is that your genitals and your genes really have nothing to do with your social role or your personality. They're simply different things, and they can and do come apart. There are biological males who express themselves in traditionally feminine ways, and there are biological females who express themselves in traditionally masculine ways. Not only does this happen, but there's nothing wrong when it happens. There's just no way your gender expression should be given your sex, or vice versa. But now, the transgender movement's come along and added an additional claim, namely that there actually can be a mismatch between your gender and your sex. That is to say, it's possible for someone of a particular gender to be born in the wrong body. This is captured in Claim 4. If it isn't already apparent, Claim 4 just doesn't fit with Claims 1 through 3. It most directly conflicts with Claim 3. 1 and 2 just fill out the theoretical background that helps us make sense of 3 and 4. On the one hand, you have the claim that there's just no way that sex and gender are supposed to fit together. It's fine to have a manly female or a womanly male. On the other hand, you have the claim that there's something wrong if you're manly and you have a female body, or if you're womanly and you have a male body. But you just can't have it both ways. You have to give one of these claims up. Either gender essentialism is false, and there's no way that sex and gender are supposed to match up, in which case the typical transgender narrative of being a man trapped in a woman's body or vice versa doesn't hold true. Or gender essentialism is true and there is a way that sex and gender are supposed to match up, in which case the trans narrative actually does hold true. In other words, transgender ideology is in direct conflict with the rejection of gender essentialism that's associated with modern feminism, at least in its normative component, that claim that there's a way that gender and sex are supposed to fit together. Indeed, transgender ideology seems to just assert the opposite, that there is a way that sex and gender are supposed to fit together, and transitioning is the way of correcting a situation where there's a mismatch between one's gender and one's sex. Because transgender activists typically accept 1 through 3 even as they add 4 to the mix, you can often find them saying contradictory things in response to different criticisms of their position. This can be really frustrating because it's hard to pin them down to one single consistent position. In some contexts, trans activists stress the point that being trans is about gender, not sex. Therefore, they say, biological arguments are irrelevant. It doesn't matter what your genes are or how your genes are expressed phenotypically. All that matters is that you have a particular gender expression and that you identify in a particular way. Gender is distinct and separable from sex, and it has no normative connection to sex. This makes it sound like they just accept claims 1 through 3. But in other contexts, trans activists themselves actually make biological arguments. For example, they point to studies that allegedly reveal differences between cisgender brains and transgender brains. And these studies are supposed to show that trans brains are more similar to the sex with which the trans person identifies. They sometimes also argue that trans people are exposed to different levels of hormones in utero, which might be responsible for these brain differences. But now it sounds like biology does matter, and more importantly, that there's such a thing as a male brain and a female brain. where brains are supposed to be closely associated with or just identical with your gender. But this is just to re-embrace a form of gender essentialism. It's to say both that a particular gender is partly defined by a particular sex, and that a particular gender is supposed to line up with a particular sex. It's now clear that they also accept Claim 4, in which case they must give up Claim 3, on pain of inconsistency. Moreover, if being trans really is just about gender and not at all about sex, then why bother with surgery that's explicitly designed to make you more physically similar to the opposite sex? Why be concerned with bathrooms and locker room access, which are pretty clearly segregated on a biological basis? Why argue for trans women competing against cis women in sports, when sports are pretty clearly segregated by sex differences, not gender identity differences? I think trans activists really do accept Claim 4. That is, they really do accept a kind of gender essentialism. Otherwise, much of their activism makes little sense, but that puts them directly at odds with a core tenet of contemporary feminism, a fact that many of them seem to fail to appreciate. So I think you've got to choose. You either go with contemporary feminism, which says there's no essential or normative connection between your gender and your sex, that is, between your preferred social role or personality and your biology, or you go with the contemporary trans movement and you say there are such connections between gender and sex. But one thing you can't do is have it both ways. Well, what do you think? Have I identified a real inconsistency in the contemporary trans movement, or am I mistaken? Let me know in the comments below. In the meantime, keep thinking critically, even when there might be some social cost to doing so. You'll make Socrates proud. See ya!